Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those who are joining. Thank you for joining the Trade Experettes today for the second webinar in our curated series on global supply chains. The first webinar that we conducted last fall looked at global trade flows and changes in global supply chains, specifically looking at whether recent policy efforts to try and shorten those supply chains or divert trade from one actor to another have worked. And I think what we found is that supply chains remain very complex, and that even when trade perhaps moves away from one country, it can move to a third and not just sort of cut complexity out of those supply chains. Whether we like it or not, we are in a highly globalized economy where multiple countries are part of our supply chains. And so we are going to look today at our second webinar in the series at environment, social, and governance policies that are a number of new initiatives in this area that are really designed to bring greater transparency and to measure both the risk and the impact of companies' supply chains across multiple sectors and markets. In particular, the EU, as they often are, have been a leader in the development of these policies in a number of ways, whether that's new rules on procurement and disclosure of supply chains, new deforestation rules that may go into effect that require disclosure on whether products may be associated with deforestation, and of course the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, known as CSRD, where we may focus a bit more of our attention today. But this is certainly a topic that any company who's engaged in global supply chains is looking at in terms of how they will approach it. We are sponsored today by PepsiCo and by Global Affairs Canada, and we appreciate their support. I am Darcy Vetter. I'm an advisor for Trade Experettes and a former U.S. trade official who has been engaged in particular agriculture and environment issues and supply chains in the private, nonprofit, and the private public sector in my career. And I'm so pleased to be able to explore this topic today with three fantastic panelists who provide interesting perspectives on the topic. Our first panelist is Samira Rafaela. Samira is a former member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands, who has long been a champion of human rights and stronger labor policies, and currently is serving as a visiting fellow at Cornell University. Our second panelist is Johansson Rutaiwa, who is the head of the Industrialization and Competitiveness Unit of the Southern African Development Community. He has extensive experience in both the development and implementation of policies throughout the region, and he has looked and written extensively on how these new ESG policies may affect companies in the region, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. And last but not least, I am pleased to be joined by Susie Kane, who is the Sustainability Senior Director for ESG reporting and data governance at PepsiCo. And as her title suggests, she is definitely an expert in both voluntary and mandatory reporting schemes and how to bring forward that transparency, how to look at marrying some of the sustainability goals and activities throughout PepsiCo's supply chain with compliance with these directives. And has long been engaged in these activities, well predating some of the mandatory rules through PepsiCo's participation in a lot of voluntary ESG reporting as well. Susie's also my former colleague, so particularly pleased to have her with us today. One small note, I will note that Samira has been very generous with her time today. She's had a recent scheduling conflict, so she will need to, she will join us for the first 30 minutes of the panel. We're going to start with her, but don't want you to be surprised if our panelists if a panelist should suddenly disappear, we'll make sure and get Samira's viewpoints in that first half of the hour, and thank you for your flexibility this morning. So with all of that out of the way, the introductions, I hope that we can just dive right in. And Samira, I do want to start with you, given that you were sort of present around the table when a number of these policies were being debated and created. And so from your perspective and from what you saw from that vantage point as a member of the European Parliament, what do you see as really the primary objective of these these new ESG rules? And can you share some insights around the debate within Europe on the priorities, the elements, and the structure of these rules, concerns around both transparency, competitiveness, et cetera, and how did they help derive what is the sort of the current day CSRD? What was in, what was out? Can you give us a little bit of insight into how these rules came to be?
Thank you very much, Darcy, and thank you to Hannah and TradeExperettes for this invitation. It's a topic very close to my heart. Indeed, as a member of European Parliament, I was part of the International Trade Committee, and I have worked on legislation in the area of corporate accountability and sustainability in general. And I think it is important to understand the context also of ESG-related legislation. The context of value-based trade, of rules-based trade, the context of the European Union wanting to be a human rights champion, but at the same time also valuing economic partnerships and trade agreements with like-minded partners. And a lot needs to change in the world when it comes to trade policies. There's a high need for inclusive trade, and there is a high need for ethical, responsible business conduct. Because we do love our companies, we do need our companies, we need it for jobs, we need it for our goods, for our services on a daily basis, but it needs to be responsible. So the ESG legislation in general is really to make sure that human rights, the environment and workers' rights are at the core of such policies, and especially business conduct. And when it comes to ESG, you already mentioned it, Darcy, this specifically is about transparency. It's about accountability. It's about how the global supply chains are organized and structured, and the level of transparency businesses and companies are giving about what exactly is going on in these supply chains, and making sure that they are clean from exploitation, that they are clean from harming the environment. And this is what you do through, for example, CSRD. So that really helps to respect the environment. Take, for example, to comply with the Paris Agreement, but also to comply with all the important human rights guidelines that we have. Think about the UN on business and human rights, but also the OECD guidelines. And it needs to contribute to all these guidelines, but even treaties that we have negotiated about throughout the years. So the CSRD is really a cornerstone of this broader sustainability agenda that the EU has proposed, and it gives a framework, it gives guidance to companies, based on certain indicators, standards, certain topics that companies need to start reporting on. And what we of course hope to achieve also with CSRD, and this is why CSDDD came into the game, but also the forced labor regulation where I could work on. What we of course need to achieve is to go beyond compliance, because we can say, okay, you tick the box, but what happens beyond that? So it's very important that companies work indeed on the transparency, making sure that the public knows and is informed about the performance of companies. It's about accountability, so holding companies accountable when it comes to the impact on society, when it comes to the impact on the environment, and of course alignment with the EU climate goals. I think this is the main context that I would like to give about CSRD. And just a small remark on the debates internally. I could, of course, I've been part of that in the European Parliament, but mainly when it comes to debates on CS-DDD, but even the deforestation legislation, the forced labor regulation. It's about finding the right balance also between what is feasible and how can we hold companies accountable. It's about the harmonization and the flexibility. There are a lot of rules, there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of data. So there's also this debate about, okay, how are we going to harmonize and standardize all the information, the rules? It also needs to be, well, easy for companies, and it needs to be flexible. And the debate was also a lot about the role of SMEs. I think it is a very interesting development that we see nowadays, that SMEs are not per se always excluded from this kind of legislation. They play a role in it, for example, also in the forced labor regulation. For the CS-DDD, we had a lot of debates about it, like how do we organize that? Because at the end, SMEs will be part of that. And I think what has been interesting in these debates on the ESG legislation is the role of the civil society organizations, of NGOs, of business representatives, and policymakers in general, how they have been consulted and engaged also in making ESG-related legislation. And if Europe wants to remain a strong player, a strong trading partner, a credible trading partner, even when it comes to strengthening geopolitical position, then this is really the way to go for Europe.
Excellent. Thank you. That's an excellent background. I want to follow up with pick up on one element here that you stressed in that debate, is that finding that balance between accountability and feasibility, between that, that going beyond compliance and making sure that that information is available. One of the things that CSRD has been both, I think, lauded and criticized for at the same time is its sheer complexity, the number of data points. And one of the questions that comes to mind for me is, transparency is important for investors, for the different stakeholders that you mentioned, to be able to see how companies are performing and also to compare them with their peers. But with the sheer volume and the complexity of the reporting, do you think there is some danger or concern that actually that data may not be particularly digestible to stakeholders who are not sort of experts in this field? Will it help to drive their behavior and help them to push companies if it is overly complex? And was that part of the debate itself?
Yes, absolutely. The burden for companies is a very common debate, and this is of course where we all need to think about. I do admit that especially in the mandate 2019-2024, a lot of ESG-related legislation came in the direction of companies, and of course I had these conversations with companies myself. A lot of companies, also SMEs, who were worried about the burden, the administrative burden. And yes, a lot comes at the same time, but like I said, at the same time, there is a high urgency, given the state of play when it comes to the environment, climate, but also human rights. If you take into account that almost 28 million people are a victim of forced labor, then I do think these numbers show that we really need to change something a lot in our global supply chain and in business conduct. So the emergency is very high. A lot of companies also admit that they want to change. They contribute to the change. I think that we see a lot of good best practices of companies already working on their due diligence, tracking their global supply chain, investing in traceability, building on local relationships, the local community, seeing how they can contribute to a living wage, even a living income. So a lot of these important topics are already addressed by companies. But when it comes to the burden, this is what we have consistently negotiated about in such legislation. Also within CS-DDD, for example, CS-DDD does say that we need to work on a platform, on networks where companies can exchange on best practices. The member states, the European Commission also needs to assist in terms of technical assistance, knowledge and expertise. The same has been done for the forced labor regulation, making sure that SMEs specifically get technical assistance. So you do see that mainstreamed throughout all that legislation, extra support, even extra measures for SMEs is mentioned in the forced labor regulation. So, and when it comes to lessen the burden, a lot of thinking needs to be put in practical tools and guidance. That's also what we work on at Cornell University Global Labor Institute. So we have, for example, presented a tool for companies to work with CSDDD, 25 labor outcomes metrics that we have studied, that are being studied. And if companies can work with these outcomes metrics, then a lot of their problems can be solved. So there are, like I said, there's already a lot of thinking when it comes to practical tools and guidance to assist companies, and I think that's highly needed, yes.
Excellent, thank you. Johansson, I'd like to turn to you now. You have written about the impact of some of these policies and your concern that both the stringency of the standards, but also the reporting requirements themselves may have an alternate effect rather than driving behavior to address those underlying ESG issues and encouraging companies to both investigate them and address them, that what may happen is that the burden will simply mean that some of those companies, particularly SMEs in Southern Africa, may just not be able to participate in those global supply chains or serve the EU market. Can you elaborate a little bit on your concern itself?
Thank you very much, Daki, and a very good morning to you. And once again, thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important topic of today. Maybe to start, the policy by EU really is a good measure, which everyone, we are in support. But looking where we are sitting, our SMEs, when you speak SMEs in Africa, is different from the context of Europe. So always one need to bear in mind that our SMEs, they are not that much competitive as the European SMEs are. And we are also still even struggling to come up with a common definition of how are we defining our SMEs. Most of them, they are still operating informally, which makes them really a bit strange for the government or public sector to support them. Now, with the new measures where these SMEs in Africa, they are still really struggling even to meet the current international standard. They are struggling to have the resources. They are not equipped with the necessary infrastructure, financial resources, technical expertise to comply with the comprehensive environmental, social, and governance reporting requirement. My feeling is that at this point when EU is bringing up the new measures, really it might really affect. And I'm saying because looking at the way we are set up, we are basically focusing more on like three sectors: agriculture, which is most the backbone of our economy. Then we have mining, where a few countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, DRC, they are focusing on that. Then we have got the manufacturing. Looking in all these sectors, you find like in the agriculture, the small, farmers, they are still struggling in terms of to meet the reporting standard that are demanded by the global supply chain. And now they don't also have the access to training, which now we force them unwillingly to be observer in the global supply chain rather than really participating. And also with the new approach or the policy with the EU, which is going now to introduce the tariff on the carbon produced product, That means it's going to increase the cost of production or the cost of operation from the SMEs in the region, which automatically they make them to be knocked out. On the sector of manufacturing and mining, where I've mentioned a few countries in the southern region who are really depending on that, they are still also struggling in terms of the expertise, the financial constraints, which really makes them, not to be able to participate in the current global chain. And most of their products, they're still more producing the carbon, which now EU is very stringent on that, want to move on the green economy, want to ensure that the environment and the human rights, as previous speakers just alluded to, they are really being observed. And the companies that in Europe that really are depending from the supply of these African SMEs, that we need to justify, provide the evidence that this product from the Southern Africa or the entire Africa, they have met the minimum requirement that has been set. So with those, I feel like, okay, in Africa, it might not really work for the time being because of the nature of how our SME is structured, and maybe they might be knocked out unwillingly, not that they want to not to participate, but the conditions are beyond their control and it's most costly for them, so they can't really make on that.
Mm-hmm. So just to summarize here, there's both the burden of the reporting itself, but also the fact that some of the companies in the region are still kind of on their journey to green their operations. And so the accounting that might be shown on the reporting may disadvantage them as suppliers for companies who want to sort of change that balance sheet or who are worried about measures at the border where that increased kind of cost of production may be there because of things like the CBAM. So that's an interesting kind of a dual concern there, right, about the reporting element itself, but also the transition process that we want to see continue and what incentives are there for that to happen. So I definitely want to come back to that point, but want to turn quickly to you, Susie, on that reporting itself and the opportunities that come from that transparency as well as the challenges. PepsiCo, of course, has long been a participant in a number of voluntary ESG reporting and certification programs, so is no sort of stranger to providing that transparency and notifying stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits and the opportunities of reporting itself? And then can you shed a little bit of light on how some of these mandatory programs like CSRD might interact with, either positively or in a challenging way, some of the voluntary reporting that's already happening?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I would say before I go farther, I want to specify something. You introduced me in the beginning as an expert on regulation and regulatory reporting. I would argue anyone claiming that at this point, maybe aside from those who wrote stuff, is probably not entirely being truthful. So I will acknowledge I have a lot of reps in the reporting space, as you say, and a longer track record with the voluntary reporting. But like everybody else, we're in the process of understanding and building ourselves and, we're setting ourselves up for compliance. As you say, we have a long history of participation in the voluntary reporting space, and those voluntary frameworks have been important. They've given companies like us years of a runway to sharpen how we manage and measure and communicate our sustainability progress. And in principle, having these shared frameworks, really helps companies to communicate in a way that drives company to company comparability in our disclosures. And ultimately that speaks well to what I think is really a fundamental point of reporting, being this building trust and ultimately driving action. And I think, keeping that as a North Star, the frameworks, the policies, they make sense. They're there for a good and valid reason. I think one thing we're also seeing is that, companies have been on this journey to understand how to comply and to produce these disclosures, but one thing we're observing, and maybe sometimes it doesn't get as much airtime, is the fact that it's also an educational tool for the end users of the reports. I think, we're learning, but there's also been a learning curve for them as well. What do they look for? What actually is decision useful information, how to identify, and ultimately how to then use it. So I think the frameworks have played an important role in that as well. As they transition now into a space of mandatory disclosure, I think the regulation is giving teeth and adding momentum to that notion of standardized reporting. And where the regulation is being built kind of with familiarity and alignment to the previous, that foundation that companies and end users are already accustomed to, I think, there's a strong argument for kind of a bit of a more streamlined evolution. That said, there is that natural evolution into the role of the frameworks. And I think we expect to see companies probably shifting their focus and their priorities as these new norms are cemented. And ultimately, I think the hope is that we can keep our eye on that bigger picture, why we're all here, which is to drive that action, to build that trust.
Excellent. Susie, I think that's a great point, that we're sort of learning from each other as we produce these first reports under the new rules. It may give us some clues on how to evolve them and to work on compliance and transparency. Samira, before we lose you, I want to return to you. And you specifically talked about, and I wanted to come back to this, one is to Susie's point, as we talk about sort of learning from each other in these first rules, there's already been some discussion, as you noted, about balancing the requirements of the law. Do you see this being an ongoing debate where the first kind of rounds of compliance may help fine tune that law? The president of the commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has mentioned this concern about feasibility. But I also wanted to ask you about that joint agenda you mentioned, to not only help companies comply, because you talked about that technical assistance, but what is the right balance between helping with compliance with the law and putting the resources toward addressing the underlying issues that are being reported? And so if you have any comment on sort of the EU's agenda on addressing human rights or building capacity to do that, as well as building capacity to report on those things, I think that tension between, is the best effort on the transparency, or should we focus more of the effort on the doing? And if you see any tension there. So I'll leave you with those two questions.
Yes, thank you very much. To start with the last point, I mean, the EU institutions specifically, so they work on legislation, and building these frameworks are highly important to make sure that we all do the right thing, companies primarily. And obviously we need legislation because these are the incentives that we can work with. These are, the judicial tools we can work with to make sure that human rights are respected in business conduct, in supply chain, the environment is respected, workers' rights, and so on. So the legislation is a starting point. What you do see when you do a close read of this legislation is that you see encouragement towards companies to go beyond the compliance, to only go beyond a regulation or a directive, and to work on the longer term effect. So, for example, training, capacity building is very important, but also in light of international cooperation, it is important to have the dialogues on what is actually feasible. I mean, if we're not all the same, so the European Union also needs to think about how they are going to work with partners, with developing countries, with the global south in general, on addressing the root causes of these problems, for example, forced labor. I'm highly in favor of organizing, thinking about programs where you can address that together. Because I do agree that we can definitely not think from only the EU perspective. We need to have the dialogue going on with our partner countries and with basically all countries that we work with. Okay, how is this going to work in your country? How is this going to work for you? And what can we address extra, or what can we do in terms of extra measures to make implementation a reality? Because we can not only think from our standards. So that I do see as a risk. And when it comes to the nowadays developments, the European Commission, von der Leyen, for example, and what's going to happen now with CSDDD, with CSRD, the omnibus project that we all talk about now in the Brussels bubble. It is the only thing I can say about that is that it's just very important to have clarity very fast, because this is what I hear from a lot of people I talk to in organizations and companies I talk to. They just want clarity on what exactly they need to do, because indeed, how far do we go in terms of technical assistance? What does that mean for companies? And I think at the end, the main effort, well, one of the main efforts has already been done. So the legislative frameworks that we have, that we now have proposed and that are on the table, well, the main efforts, of course, are also with businesses, are with the companies, to invest in due diligence, to invest in technology, innovation, practical tools, traceability tools, to make sure that the supply chain is free from violations in all the relevant areas. So, and this is where absolutely the EU can inspire companies. This is where we need to have the dialogues also with companies, also the think tanks, the academic sphere, the academic environment are having these conversations with companies on what to do, what kind of knowledge and expertise they can use. But at the end, the responsibility is with companies to do it well, because if not, if they don't, they will bump into the new EU legislation.
I realize that we're coming up on your time. Can we shift gears for just one moment? And that is, we've talked about the EU's leadership in, focusing on transparency, on driving that investment that you just mentioned, on making sure that supply chains are clean and there are, the appropriate mechanisms in place. I think you see the debate in some ways in the United States shifting in the opposite direction, where you have, political change, where there is, an insistence of perhaps rolling back on some of the climate action. There have been real pressures on companies with sort of an anti-woke agenda to say maybe you should be less worried about diversity, equity, inclusion, some of those human rights issues. And that companies should just focus on the fundamentals, right? Their bottom line, not these things. I think, we saw at one point the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US had proposed similar reporting requirements, much more streamlined than CSRD, but even those now seem to be on hold. And so we have sort of divergent paths between Europe and the US and some other countries as well. And I think there has been a sense by many US companies of welcome relief, perhaps, that the US is not pushing forward. But given that so many US companies are actively engaged in the global economy, it feels like they will have to be reporting and examining their supply chains, regardless of whether the US implements its own CSRD or reporting directive. So, do you feel like the stepping back in the US sort of gives US companies a free pass, or does it simply require them to meet standards and metrics that are being set by the EU and other countries? I mean, how do you see this dynamic unfolding?
My last small point would be, at the end, this is a global fight. and this is a global struggle. I think in both the EU and the US, we have seen best practices, good examples. And I think the main focus should be on how the US and the EU, as two very important giant players, can work together, can harmonize as much as possible. I also speak to a lot of US companies, and I see that a lot of them want to do the good job. And there are a lot of good practices also coming from the US side. I think in general, globally, there is a backslide. Also here in the EU, as I observe now the discussion on this legislation. So I would say dialogues on the government level remains very important. I hope that they will keep doing that, the US and the EU both. So let's focus on what is possible in terms of international cooperation with like-minded countries. I do believe that a lot of opportunities are there because I see it with my own eyes. And I need to leave you with that.
I know,
Thank you so
that's
much.
an excellent point to leave on, I think, is the need for cooperation, both governments, but among global industry as well. Thank you for your time, Samira. Really
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Us. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. On that, I think really useful note, right, that global governments need to be in consultation with one another about the standards that we're all trying to push forward, right, and how to comply. Johansson, I wanted to go back to you and ask you, you've talked about kind of both the challenge of the reporting, but also wanting to make sure that we encourage and don't discourage countries in the Southern African region in particular to keep making that transition toward better practices and not feel discouraged by these policies. If you had the pen in your hand, what ways would you either modify or create supporting policies around CSRD to address some of your concerns about those maybe competing incentives that you see coming out of CSRD? What would you do differently?
Thank you again. Very pertinent question. Yeah, because we should not be really talking of the challenge. We should be finding the way to address this challenge. And to me, with the new regulations under EU, what I would first think of first is in terms of ensuring that the process should be gradual and extend the timelines so that we allow the SMEs in the Southern Africa to be able to adjust and comply with the new regulations. While we are doing the gradual implementation, at the same time, we are trying to capacitate the SMEs in terms of the area that they need the support. And this can also be in terms of the training as well, also the financial support, which can come along with the cooperation with the local government or the national government to see how really the SMEs can be supported, accessing the resources and be able to comply. So one, gradual implementation and extend the timelines, the way we do under WTO, under the special and the differential treatment, where the least developed countries are given more time to be able to meet or to comply with the set of new rules and the regulation. The last one is in terms of the simplified way of reporting. Rather than really burdening the SME to be reporting with a new regulation, which seems to be very complicated to them, the approach could be simplified, but in a manner that it doesn't lose the focus of transparency and without burdening them a lot. And for example, we can allow, say, the SMEs should be allowed to report their core business, their priority activity which they're doing, which is adding much value, but also very transparent what is coming in or what is composing the product that they're producing to be able to meet the European market, other than telling them to be reporting everything. And remember, as I indicated earlier, collection of data or the data tools collection approach is still really, they are still struggling in the region. They can't even really produce their own data. Now, with the new really laws, it requires them to be producing the data. So in that manner, the reporting can be more complicated and end up not really be able to submit or to what is required under EU. So to me, the three areas really I would think can work if EU rules and regulation have to work in the African context.
Great. So really pick those core elements, provide time, and then maybe simplify the data. I think those are very practical suggestions. And I think, Susie, they really dovetail very nicely with the comment that I loved that you made in that first response, which is that there aren't really any experts in ESG reporting yet, because we're all still learning this. And that even a company like PepsiCo with global reach, with really broad and deep supply chains, is still sort of figuring out how to meet those data points and gather the information and produce it in the best way and to match it with our own sustainability goals. So I'd like for you to expand a little bit on that and to marry it a little bit with what Samira said, which is like ultimately what we need is for companies to invest in making sure that their supply chains are addressing those ESG issues. Given sort of PepsiCo's experience, right, in all the voluntary reporting that we've already done, the company has already done all of the efforts that have been made to start thinking about compliance with CSRD, right? This is, I think that, Samira made the point that companies are already investing now to be able to comply with a law that doesn't fully come into force for quite some time because it is extensive. How do you think that companies like PepsiCo or others can sort of share that experience, both to enable their peers or SMEs to be able to comply, but also to perhaps direct governments toward the kind of compliance or the kind of indicators that are most meaningful, that really demonstrate what it is they're trying to go after? Could you talk a little bit about that balance?
Absolutely. So I think, first off, I was struck, Johansen, hearing you describe, your preferences and challenges by the fact that even though we're talking about entities at vastly different ends of kind of the size and complexity scales, a lot of the principles are shared, actually. I think we also, for probably slightly different reasons, would also benefit well from things like, longer lead time to prepare, clarity, and kind of some flexibility in terms of the disclosures themselves. And I think the question, Darcy, on how can PepsiCo, what I heard was essentially how can we help support the global conversation across different stakeholders? And I think I might nuance the question a bit, if you don't mind, in that I think as the different jurisdictions are building their own requirements, it's probably, yes, the metrics themselves are very important. But I'd argue the fact of materiality and the kind of call on companies to assess what is truly, important and meaningful for them does help to some degree to mitigate that risk. Now, beyond just the data points themselves, there's a lot of other factors that these jurisdictions can adopt or not adopt or nuance that actually can also play a really big role in the way that they impact businesses and the feasibility of businesses to report. So just like some examples, for example, are the scope and the basis. There's some jurisdictions that have kind of a legal entity level basis. A specific legal entity needs to cross a certain number of thresholds to be in scope, whereas we have other ones that are kind of at a country level or even global. We have different mechanisms of consolidation allowed. The CSRD has this artificial consolidation basis, at least on a short term. We have different timing. We have different assurance requirements. We even have different locations for where the disclosure itself will be housed, be it inside of a financial filing or outside. That's I could keep going. Is it climate only? Does it include other topics? And how closely aligned to other standards are they? And I think we have been on this journey long enough to start kind of lifting up the rocks and seeing like, ooh, there's a complexity that we hadn't appreciated and start to work through it. But as a reminder, you know, we're all sitting kind of at the square one of these disclosures starting to come through. I mean, we're at January 15th now. I think that's what, 2 weeks into the first year of reporting for CSRD. So like everyone, we have a keen eye to kind of how it starts to unfold in reality, and we're rapidly tracking requirements. And so I think one thing that we have to offer is kind of a broad network. And I think we're leveraging our colleagues around the world who have a close ear to the ground in their respective markets to understand the types of things that are popping up, because in all honesty, they're popping up quickly. And so, you know, leveraging internal networks, working with external networks to share information, to share interpretation in some instances, industry groups, other kind of connections. You mentioned working with the standard setters themselves, and I'd say that's also an important one that we found to be useful. I think what's both great about things like the CSRD, you know, the fact that they represent multiple perspectives and that everyone's had a say in how it lands, also can be a challenge because not everyone also has the experience on the ground of delivering on those. And so I've been grateful for the opportunity personally, and I think as an organization, to sit on some of these groups. I work with the ISSB and their sustainability reference group. I've sat in previously on conversations with EFRAG for sector-specific standards, and I think it's important for business to be able to lend their voice, be they large like PepsiCo or small and even small and medium entities, also to kind of make their own unique challenges heard and understood as these things are being written in real time. Last, in terms of supporting partners, I think, you know, it's early again because we're all figuring it out. I agree that as much kind of people, process, technology that we can kind of throw at it, probably the better, but it needs to be geared towards a clearly defined end goal. And so I would absolutely reiterate the earlier point that clarity and clarity soon does all of us a favor. You know, where we're starting to you know, develop our approaches, our tools and the like, I think, you know, there's a sense that we're all in this together. And I do anticipate, you know, seeing an uptick in participation in, for example, our partners' materiality assessments and kind of sharing what's working and what's not working. Ultimately, again, we are really all in this together.
Yeah. So I think, Susie, you made a couple of good points. And I think one of them that came to mind for me is that ESG reporting has its own vocabulary even. You know, you talked about materiality and, you know, which risks or which things companies report on sort of depends on how companies think that data point is material to the company's bottom line. So different companies may report on different things. You brought up the fact that the CSRD has one approach in terms of what you would report on, and it's both environment and climate and social, whereas the ISSB, which is more of an international standard that a number of other countries, dozens of them, are looking at potentially adopting for now, is really just focused on climate indicators. Could you talk a little bit about these different and sometimes not necessarily competing, but you know, different like entity levels? Is it just, are you just reporting on your activities in that market? Are you reporting on that market and other, you know, countries around the globe, those activities, sort of the different approaches? Could you talk a little bit about the challenges for a company like PepsiCo, who may be reporting on the same thing in different ways, depending on which company or which country we're reporting in and the way those rules are written? I think that's kind of an important element that doesn't get talked about very often.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And actually, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, even in the question itself. You know, a company like ours generally sets a global agenda, and that's executed in a localized way in different markets by different businesses and the like. But, you know, we are accustomed to telling our story in a holistic way and to measuring and conveying progress kind of across, you know, the breadth of our businesses and our operations. I think this definitely represents a new moment for corporate disclosure, in that, you know, we are being asked to kind of fragment that story in some senses. I think one area that personally kind of challenges me is that where we're making investments to comply, you know, we're having to really get down to an incredible level of granularity, which has its benefits. But I will acknowledge that, you know, legal entity driven disclosure for a company as large as ours really isn't, in my mind at least, very decision useful. You know, you might have a holding company in some country in Europe that you know, doesn't conduct its own climate risk assessments and you know, that acts on and executes on the global agenda. And so to dig in, you know, they don't have their own strategy. So I think I understand the value and the desire to have kind of understand what's really happening in your home, your backyard. I also think that there's a risk of, you know, localized disclosure being taken out of context and not telling the holistic picture. And so I think as we start to put pen to paper, that's something that I personally have a keen eye to, which is how do you make sure that almost despite these somewhat fragmented requirements, we're able to continue to report transparently on kind of our broader and global cross-cutting agenda.
Yeah, I think that telling that consistent story with some of those same metrics is important, not only because so many companies are operating globally, but you know, also because we do want shareholders, stakeholders to be able to ask the right questions and drive the right behavior. And if they're looking at things reported in different places in different ways, it's hard to digest that data. And that, I think, Johansson, I want to go back to you, but before we do that, you'll see Hannah put something in the chat saying if there's that last question you have, you know, feel free to put it into the chat now. Before I go to this last question for Johansson, please, if you have a question, we may have a couple minutes at the end to try and address that. Feel free to put that in the chat now if you'd like to see that addressed. So given, you know, Samira's closing comments, what Susie just said, I think what's clear from this conversation is that companies, governments both North and South, right, need to be actively engaged in a conversation and need to be contributing in various ways to driving the behavior we all want to see, right? Continuing that transition to greener manufacturing practices, or making sure that worker rights are respected, and providing the transparency to do that. So, you know, Johansson, I'm going to ask you to put on your kind of I guess your take out your pen, or like you'll have the control. What would you tell the different sectors that they should do, like their role to drive this? So, you know, what do you think is the role of like the EU government, the members of the European Parliament, the Commission? What about you and your role as a sort of governmental and capacity building entity in the region? And then what about the companies that are in Southern Africa? What do they need to focus on? Both maybe the big multinational players that are present, but also their SME partners. What would you like to see sort of each of them do, or what do you think we need from them for the region to sort of succeed?
Actually, I'm the believer of inclusive and supportive measures or regulations. And that should be the entry point of all policies that we are always crafting. And for EU, for its policy to have the impact in the region is to be inclusive and supportive. And this is now where I'm coming to your question. What is EU supposed to do in the other Western government? The first thing EU and the other Western government should acknowledge and recognize that there are disparities in terms of capacity for the companies based in the North and the companies based in the Southern. They should not be put in the same basket. Having understood that they are not in the same basket, there should be a clear support that dedicated to the Southern companies, so that they can be able to comply with the required new regulation that EU is putting. And this will make them really to be able to achieve the environmental and sustainable as well as the governance as it's being stipulated. That should be number one. But also, EU should never forget to work closely with other multilateral and other agents, international agents, to ensure that they are aligning their support and their regulation with the Southern or the African government priorities. We have a danger where multinational companies, the Western governments, the United Nations, the African banks, to mention just a few, they come up with their proposal, but which is not linked with the priorities of the national government in Africa. And then they end up being frustrated, or we end up being penalizing the companies for not complying. Why no, without knowing that the measure that you brought, it was not really aligned with the national priorities or national measures to make the SMEs or to make the private companies to be able to comply with international regulation. In terms of the private sector, we have two private sectors here. We have the northern private sector, which are the major companies, which are relying to outsource their supplies from the southern companies, which majority of them are SMEs. What is required now under this? The northern companies should be able to mentor the southern companies by providing the best practice, providing the training that will be able or will make these companies from the southern to be able to meet the required standard. And remember, when it comes to standards, even Southern Africa itself, we are still struggling. We can't even meet our own standard. The product from Zambia can't meet the standard from Southern Africa. So now imagine the proximity of less than 1,000 kilometers, they can't meet their own standard. And now you are talking of 3,000 plus kilometers to meet the standard. Is it feasible? It's not. So really the mentorship should be there, the capacity and the training that is geared to address the challenges and the and the shortcoming that the SME is facing. In terms of the local government and institution, what is it required from them? The government is supposed to avail the resources to ensure that they put in place the policies that are very supportive for the companies in the region to be able to comply with their international standard. As I indicated in point number 1 on the role of the Western and the EU government, it's always tricky where we are sitting when we get the new policies, the new regulation, and you find we are caught out of surprise. We are not prepared, and we are supposed to start implementing the policy immediately before we even prepare our business community, before we even align the new regulation and the policies with our national policies and the regulation. So it's important for the national government to ensure that the new regulation are very much aligned to their national regulation and policies, so that it gives the room for these companies, particularly the SME, to be able to operate, other than being penalized that they are not complying. And yet, they are not complying. It's not for their own willingness. It's because there's no laws that is governing them. When they take a product to export to EU, they be cleared based on the local or the national standards. And when it gets to EU, they're saying, no, you are not meeting the standard. And that's where the confusion starts coming. They'll be saying, no, internally we have been approved. We're told the product is safe to enter the European market, but we are reaching here, we're being told this is not meeting the standard. Who to believe? So we really need to ensure that the national government and the private sector are working together to ensure that they've got a good enabling environment to support the SME to operate and meet the standard.
I think that is a really great point to end on, as we have come to the end of our of our time, and that is that coordination, the outreach, the dialogue, right? All three of our panelists have made that point, that government to government, we need to coordinate what those standards are and how they ladder up from local to national to those international standards. Business to business, what are the best practices we can share with one another? How can we share experience in being able to report on these things? And the international institutions, right? Who's sitting in the place where we can maybe convene those conversations and make sure that industry and government are also talking to each other from those different perspectives, whether they be in Southern Africa or in Purchase, New York, where PepsiCo is headquartered. So again, thank you so much for your time. I think we've explored this conversation from a number of perspectives. We've seen both the challenge, but also the opportunity, and I think the genuine desire from all sides that we use transparency around ESG to try and drive and enable and build the capacity for better behavior. But it will probably take some time as we implement these policies to get that balance right and to see how it evolves. So thank you to all three of our panelists, the two of you especially here, for your commitment in making that balance work in the long term. And thanks to all of you for joining us today, and look forward to the next step in the curated series. So thanks to the TradeExperettes and our sponsors today, and have a good day, everyone.